The first thing I need you to imagine is the smell of betrayal. Not metaphorical, the real, small, domestic kind that tastes like cheap cologne and burned toast. Picture me standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, the apartment around. Me still, my hands shaking, clutching a tiny bottle that had once been something I trusted to be part of my marriage. I never thought I'd be the person to set a trap. I never thought I'd laugh about it afterward. But that night, when I finally saw the messages and the pictures, when the man I married, the man whose head I'd brushed as he slept, whose socks I'd folded, whose name I'd written on our joint checks, was casually arranging another life with someone else, something in me went cold and very, very decisive. Was I wrong for what I did? Tell me if you would have done the same thing. Would you have let it slide, or would you have burned that tiny, perfect little lie down? I should probably rewind because the part that grabs attention, the glue, the firefighters, the viral level embarrassment, is only the explosive end of a long, slow burn. My husband, for most of our marriage, was the sort of man who could charm a PTA room into silence and then talk them into volunteering for the school's bake sale. He had the laugh that made strangers think he was on their side immediately. I loved that. I loved him. But love doesn't come with a clause that makes you blind. Over the last year, he became distracted, late, and strangely secretive. At first, I convinced myself it was work. Then it was stress. Then I found lipstick on his collar and a receipt folded into the pocket of his winter coat. A receipt for dinner from a restaurant in the part of town he claimed he never went to. That was when my chest emptied and I started breathing like someone double-checking exits. I started paying attention, not in a way that would show I was paying attention, but like someone watching a movie desperately trying to spot the villain before the cops do. I opened his email once when he left it unlocked and felt sick as I read messages that were all casual intimacy and dates and details I hadn't been invited to. I won't lie. The first hour after the discovery, I was a mess. I cried until there were no tears left. I knocked over a glass and left it there so I could see it the next morning and know I had been wrecked. Then, like a slow film speeding up, I moved into the part of grief that's not tears but plans. I met her, not because I wanted to, but because the universe has a way of making the truth more personal. I ran into her at the grocery store, of all places, walking down the aisle with exactly the sort of nonchalance my husband used to have. She smiled the same bored, practiced smile he used to give me at parties, the kind that always told me he'd rather be anywhere else. I could have confronted her then. I could have screamed in the frozen foods and felt vindicated. Instead, I watched her from the pasta section and tried to decide what would make the hurt feel like it had meaning. Revenge, I realized, is not always about hurting. Sometimes it's about reclaiming. I wanted a story I could tell. A story that would make the betrayal so visible that it couldn't be gaslit away with the old words. I wanted closure. I wanted him to understand, in a way he'd never forget, what it meant to break the person who had built their life around him. Now, I need to be clear on something important because I owe you honesty. I did not want to harm anyone physically. I did not plan to cause lasting damage. My intention was humiliation and exposure, not injury. There's a moral line that, once crossed, changes a person. I told myself I would not cross that line. But the line felt slippery and small when I stood in the bathroom and looked at 2 bottles that had almost identical shapes. I worked hard to keep the story funny in my head, because horror is easier to swallow when you can make a punchline at the end. The pompous man, stuck in a ridiculous tableau, the heroic firefighter pulling apart a marriage they didn't know they were saved from. It sounded absurd enough to be believable. The plan, which I debated and reheated and rewrote in my head for 3 sleepless nights, involved swapping one small bottle for another. I staged everything with the same meticulousness I used to plan our vacations, except now the itinerary was betrayal. I cleaned the bathroom until the tiles shone and wrote myself little notes so I wouldn't forget what time he left, or who was supposed to be in their car. I did not go into the realm of instruction here. I won't tell you where to buy anything or how to make anything. I can only tell you that on the night it happened, I went through my small domestic rituals, a cup of lukewarm coffee, an extra sweep of the hallway, and then waited. It's strange how ordinary things become instruments of cinema when your life is about to split in two. He came home later than usual, the kind of late that smells like cologne and adrenaline. He kissed me on the cheek, a businessman's peck, distracted and oddly practiced, and told me he had to handle something and would be back. That was the text I would later screenshot and send to friends who needed to see the absurdity of the man who double-booked his lies. I watched him slip out of his jacket and into the other life he'd been experimenting with. I followed the script I'd written in my head for nights. Pretend to sleep, wait for the unexpected, then capture the proof. Proof, I had learned, is a very neat thing. It's a photograph, a message, a timeline you can show to people who will believe you. The series of events that night was almost farce. He didn't come home alone. I saw the other woman come up the stairs with him, two silhouettes moving in a way that made my stomach do that strange animal twist. They didn't bother much with subtlety. Neither did I. I felt a complicated mix of rage and cold clarity. When two people are careless with what they think is private, they forget how fragile privacy can be when someone is watching. I opened my door and pretended to be asleep, a dramatic sleeper, heart pounding so loud I thought my neighbors might call the cops. The sounds that followed, the light kiss, the sudden small giggles, the shuffle of clothing, felt obscene in the small apartment that had been our domestic paradise. I waited until the moment when they leaned into that dangerous private space where nothing but trust should be present, and then I took my phone out and pressed record because if there was going to be theater, then there would be an audience. What happened next is where the story bends into the ridiculous and the cruel at once. I had prepared a small bottle that looked like what they expected it to be. I will not tell you what the bottle contained, and I will not explain the chemistry or logistics. Those are details that can become dangerous if someone tries to replicate what happened. What I will say is that it held a substance that caused an immediate, dramatic adhesion in a highly awkward context. The initial reaction was almost cinematic. Muffled screams, frantic movement, the horrible realization that this was not going to be a quick, hush-hush affair. They were stuck. Stupid as that word is, stuck is the only one that fits. And here's where I admit something ugly. Part of me reveled in the absurdity. The man who had deceived me was suddenly fighting his way out of a situation that exposed him beyond words. The other woman, the one who'd been smiling down grocery aisles, was wide-eyed and terrified. I felt a satisfaction so raw it surprised me. Neighbors started banging on walls. Someone downstairs screamed. I hadn't anticipated the sound of other people's moral outrage, the way it amplifies a small domestic tragedy into a neighborhood spectacle. My heart was a drum. Adrenaline painted my hands white. I called 911. Yes, I called. The reason is twofold. First, because I knew what the consequences of the situation could be, and second, because I knew my act had crossed from private catharsis into public emergency. Firefighters arrived with helmets and practiced calm. Their professional confusion when I told them what had happened was a real thing. The sort of incredulous look that people get when life hands them a scenario from a dark comedy. They assessed. They tried basic separation techniques, and when that didn't work, they called for backup. The building smelled faintly of cologne and panic. If I'm honest, the image of two adults being gently coaxed apart by a calm, efficient team of strangers is something I'll never unsee. There were jokes on social media later about it. Videos looped, people tutting and laughing and deciding who won. My intent was not to create a spectacle. I did want him to feel small. I did not want to watch crews of paramedics and neighbors and the other woman file into the story of my home like extras in a morality play. But life is messy and public, and sometimes our private choices have public consequences. The firefighters worked with quiet competence, and after what felt like both an eternity and a blink, they managed to separate them without injury. The emergency services were professional, and they took statements, and the police took photos like patient archivists of the ridiculous. Here's the mid-story question I want to put to you, exactly as I put it to myself that night, as I sat on our couch with a blanket over my knees and a police officer's flashlight throwing giant shadows on the ceiling. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have called the police earlier? Would you have done nothing? Would you have confronted them with tears or with a lawyer? Or with a cooler head? I wrestled with whether to press charges. I wrestled with whether this was petty or righteous. I wrestled with the image of our friends and family watching footage of the night their respectable couple became a trending hashtag. If you think I'm asking for absolution, I'm not. I want to know whether the line I crossed is one you recognize as justified, because there's power in knowing where the moral center of your audience sits. After the firefighters left and the police filed their reports, the domestic theater moved to the next act: confrontation. He tried, of course, to gaslight. Words like spontaneous, she was the one, it just happened. His narrative was the old, tired one, that he was a victim of temptation and there was no premeditation on his part. I had evidence. I had recordings. I had the look on his face when he realized that his hands, which had once comforted me through rough nights, had now become symbols of his betrayal. Friends took sides in the usual way. People take sides. Some clung to the man they had known. Others looked at the accumulation of evidence and understood the pattern. My family rallied. My sister kept saying, "You are not alone." The other woman apologized in the way of someone who had been publicly humiliated. It was less apology and more a defensive, "I didn't know." I didn't need that kind of apology. I needed the cold, final dismantling of the life we'd built as if it were a set piece that could be simply unassembled. We separated. That word feels clinical, but the act was raw. We sat across from each other at the dining table with our lawyer present, and we signed papers with fingers that trembled in different ways. He tried to bargain for things that had no monetary value but had sentimental weight: the framed photos, the guitar he had taught our nephew to play, the silly mugs he collected. In the end, those were small things. The larger thing was the breaking of trust, and no legal document can plaster over that. People asked if I was proud of what I did. People asked if I would do it again. My answers were complicated. I was proud that I took back a measure of control in my life, but ashamed of how far I'd allowed myself to be pushed. The moral ledger doesn't balance neatly with satisfaction. Sometimes the cost of justice is a blunted moral compass. After the separation, life felt like it had to be rebuilt from the kitchen flood up. There were days when it hurt so much that I got up in the night and just sat on the floor and let the cold tile remind me that I was still alive. There were other days when the absurdity of the firefighters pulling them apart made me laugh until my sides cramped. Mostly, there was the slow, patient work of becoming myself again. I met with a counselor who told me, gently and without judgment, that revenge is often a momentary salve and that healing comes from different, slower labor. I started running in the mornings, the kind of running that clears a head and proves your body still obeys you. I reconnected with friends. I learned how to sleep without the constant small panic I used to carry. Social media was its own furnace. Clips from that night were shared and reshared by people who loved a good scandal. Strangers messaged me with sympathy and with cruelty. One person wrote, "Karma served hot," and another wrote, "You should be ashamed." I read them all because, in a strange way, seeing the wide variety of opinions helped me understand that whatever I did, I had stepped into a public conversation about marriage, trust and drama that people love to weigh in on. The most surprising thing was the unexpected kindness. Notes from people who had been cheated on and who wrote to say, "I would have done the same, and I am okay now." Those tiny confessions felt like small bandages. Legally, there were consequences. There were fines, there were forms, there were potential civil suits that got dropped when both parties decided reputation mattered less than moving on. I won't claim everything went my way, because it didn't. There was regret in the aftermath, not about the discovery or the leaving, but about the moment when I chose spectacle over quiet dignity. I told myself, as anyone does when trying to survive, that sometimes you learn more from your worst decisions than your best ones. The firefighters would always be a comic aside in my story. The sadness was a main course. I had stood up for myself in a way that made people notice. I had also turned a private pain into a public event, and that has its own moral cost. So what is the moral here? The obvious one is, don't cheat. But moralizing is rarely the whole truth. A deeper lesson for me was about agency. For too long, I'd allowed his charm and deferred conversations to make me small. The act of planning, even a grotesque, silly plan, reminded me that I had the power to set boundaries and to end things that were harmful. Another lesson was about spectacle. It feels empowering in the moment to create a public monument to a private wrong, but the relief is short, and the healing comes from rebuilding, not from applause. I also learned that people will make swift moral judgments without knowing your story, and that you shouldn't live for the approval of strangers. If you were on my side, like this video, if you think I went too far, that's okay. Tell me why in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this if you want to keep hearing the messy, human confessions that make us squirm. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Tell me if you would have done the same thing, or if you'd have walked away silently. I still don't know if what I did was the right thing in any universal sense, but I know it forced a rotten thing out into the light. And sometimes light is what separates the mess we can clean up from the mess we ignore. Whatever you think of my choices, thank you for listening to my story. I'll see you all in the next story.